Welcome back to the Wenke podcast, and today we are going to talk about basically 3 books that I think are some of the more influential books in the topic of culture, politics, current, let's say, political, but also just like cultural movements is probably the best way to put it. And I think they do a really good job of like articulating what's going on and why. And I will say that my biggest criticism of them is that they don't necessarily present the most comprehensive plan as to how to deal with the different problems that they articulate. But the problem with the problems, I suppose, is that they're so complicated that it's not entirely clear how you would deal with them precisely. And then on top of that, they're fairly new, and they're accelerating at rates that most social movements in the past haven't, primarily due to the introduction of social media and technology that's moving at a scale that we really can't keep up with. So I sympathize with these different authors in their plight, but I do appreciate their work to articulate what's going on. So let's get right into it. So first one's going to be The Coddling of the American Mind, and I've probably referenced this on the podcast before. So to my 3 fans, that one is one of my favorite books, honestly. It's an excellent book. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. Jonathan Haidt's probably the more famous one of those two. Quick shout out to his book, The Righteous Mind. I've not read it, which if my cousin Travis is listening, he'll yell at me, and he should, because he read it and told me it was one of the best books in the evolutionary psychology, moral dimension, if I'm getting that right even, that he's read. It was a very good book, in other words, from what he was telling me. So definitely need to put that in the list for me, which it definitely is on that. But basically the authors, Greg and Jonathan, they got together and they looked at what's happening in America specifically, but the West more broadly, in terms of this introduction of culture of safetyism, is what they dub it. And they talk about how it's originated in academia and how it's affecting students and young people in greater rates. And they believe that it's having negative consequences for mental health, academic freedom, and the ability to engage in productive dialogue. And if you've been paying attention for the past 5 years, mental health, negative academic freedom. If you're outside of the academic world, you may not notice this one as much, but comedians won't even go on college campuses anymore, pretty much. There have been a number of prominent people that you could argue were just relatively neutral actors that are getting shouted off college campuses and banned from them. So there's some interesting examples there that we can dive into as well. And the ability to engage in productive dialogue. Well, if you've been on Twitter as of late, you have noticed this, but there's definitely been a problem with, let's say, civil discourse would be the buzzword. Free speech as such. People have been, or at least it seems to me that a large percentage of people have lost the ability to engage in dialogue with someone that they just disagree with, and not allow that disagreement to cloud the discussion and prevent them from having the discussion in a civil manner. So that's rather unfortunate. A bit about the book, and I suppose I'll take a step back here. So the impetus for this was, I like all 3 books, and I've kind of always wanted to talk about certain books that I think have influenced me heavily and then could be positive forces for other people. And these 3 kind of fit within the same category. So the first one's The Coddling of the American Mind. The second one is The Parasitic Mind by Gad Saad. Interesting name. He's a professor. And then the final one is Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier, which is probably the best way to describe that book is one of the most terrifying books that I've read within the cultural dimension. And that book has a lot of like baggage to it, so I probably should do its own episode on that book. and I probably could do its own episode on each of these, but the overview I thought would be useful, and I haven't read any of them in a while, so I would want to actually reread the book before I did just a dedicated podcast episode on it, because, it's easy to lose specifics when you haven't read a book in 1 to 2 years. So, but let's go back to the Calling the American Mind, and again, the goal of this is to outline, okay, why are these such good books? Why should you read them? And how have they impacted me? So we'll get right back into it. So Gregg and Haidt identified these 3 great untruths, as they call them. And the first is the untruth of fragility, which suggests that people are inherently vulnerable and need protection from offensive or uncomfortable ideas. The second is the untruth of emotional reasoning, which prioritizes feelings over facts and logic. And the final one is the untruth of us versus them, which fosters a polarized mindset and undermines empathy and understanding. So let's take each of them in turn, at least for right now. So this untruth of fragility, and it's interesting, Nietzsche said it best, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and he's actually true, and this actually goes to a broader topic of psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy, and the ways that you even get over phobias. So that's some interesting psychological roots from a scientific perspective. But more broadly speaking, there's this idea that's been promulgated specifically on college campuses, which posits that people are inherently fragile creatures, and the goal in an academic environment should be to shield you from potentially harmful information, and so that you don't have a potentially negative emotional reaction to such information is the idea. And we've seen the introduction of things like trigger warnings, which to most normal people would seem quite odd, but within academia, specifically within certain departments, that's very common, that these trigger warnings are now in the fronts of, or in the first pages of books, and are in the first words of professors at the beginning of lectures. And they can be quite innocuous things, such as, the book talks about, a time of slavery, or a time when women didn't have the same rights as men, things like that. And you've seen what would have been some of the more comical and yet equally terrifying examples of, you'll have speakers like Ben Shapiro, who is a right-wing commentator. He has his own show, etc. And he'll go on to college campuses, and they'll literally set up safe rooms, safe spaces is what they call them, for college students. Yes, 18 to 22-year-olds, and they have coloring books in these safe spaces because Ben Shapiro and his ideas are so scary and so dangerous. And this is the extreme version of this, but it is one of the underlying problems that has permeated both academia, but it's also started to permeate culture as such, where people seem to be just incapable of engaging in dialogue or engaging in conflict conflict in the sense of just a civil disagreement, just disagreeing with someone on an intellectual level. That has been a thing that is now a thing of the past, from what I can tell, to a large extent. And although it's difficult to discern, how bad the issue is, but it's definitely gotten worse. So this untruth or fragility is massive. And one more point here about this, because I referenced it, the entire basis of psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy is what it's called, is specifically I'll narrow it, specifically in the realm of phobias, or if you have a fear, is intentional gradual exposure to the stimulus in order to get over the negative consequences of that stimulus. So the way to cure someone if they have a fear of something, or if they're scared of something, is to get them to slowly, granted, voluntarily decide to confront micro versions of that thing. So say they have a fear of needles, right? You would get them, first step would be okay, how about we just talk about needles? Let's think of what one might look like. Next step would be let's see a picture of one. Next step would be can I have one in the room? We've developed this relationship of trust. There's no funny business going on here, which trust is critical in a psychotherapeutic relationship. I'm going to put one in the room. Can you deal with that? And then as this goes on, you essentially heighten the stimulus to the point where the actual thing no longer elicits the same degree of the negative reaction that brought you into the psychotherapy in the first place. And this goes down to the depths of human psychology, but it turns out that, no, people are quite resilient, and when you confront something voluntarily, that's the cure. So from a psychotherapeutic perspective, from a life perspective, from a practicality perspective, pragmatically, this is how things work. When you choose to confront it, the dragon that thing was ceases to be such a dragon. It matters when you pay attention to something and you decide to confront it voluntarily. And this goes to another concept, which is this idea of eustress, which is where you actually decide to put stress upon yourself. So this would be, within the fitness community, it'd be, going in the sauna, where it's a stressful environment, but it's actually good for you, or working out, or you decide, I'm going to take on this new responsibility, and I know it's going to cause me stress, but I'm going to do it and then find out that I'm actually capable of it. And that facilitates growth. The opposite is when you're seemingly forced into a stressful situation. That actually generally is not good for you. So there's a massively different set of biochemical and psychological things that go on, let's say, when you choose to confront something voluntarily versus when it happens to you against your will. And this great untruth of humans being fragile has been permeated in our culture, and it's just backwards. So let's go to the second one. The second is the untruth of emotional reasoning, which prioritizes feelings over facts and logic. And I'll go back to Ben Shapiro here because I have to. His most famous tweet, "Facts don't care about your feelings." And it's true, they do not. But the authors point to the fact that we've overcorrected. Well, maybe I wouldn't even go there, but emotional, I guess the broad point is emotional reasoning. Listening to your emotions as guidance as to the reality of a situation has become more pervasive. So what they point out is that your emotions are an incredibly unreliable metric as to the underlying truth of the issue. So you may find something incredibly distressing, or you may be incredibly sad about something, but that doesn't change what's actually going on. You using your emotions as the guide is generally a folly pursuit. That doesn't mean you should ignore them. I'm a big fan of counseling and discussing emotional reactions and states. I think that's imperative because normally they hint at something. But to use them as your wholehearted guide, especially in difficult situations, if all you did was listen to your emotions in a difficult conversation with your spouse about something complicated, you'd be incapable of actually solving that problem and having that discussion in a coherent manner. So when it gets prioritized above, everything has its place. So their argument essentially is that when you prioritize emotions more than they should be prioritized, it becomes a detrimental state. And the truth is the truth is in reverse, of course, too, is when you don't prioritize them or ignore them or suppress them, you're also making an error. But their claim is that we're pushing emotional reasoning over rational reasoning more these days than vice versa, which, if you go on Twitter or watch the news cycle, that will make a lot of sense. So that's the second one. And the third one is this untruth of us versus them, which is this mentality in life of okay, it's constantly a battle between good and evil, or it's a battle between my group versus this other group. And it turns out that the truth is we're all individuals that don't know anything, that are trying to make sense of the world. And the world is incredibly complicated. And the second that we become more tribalistic and more in-group versus out-group, the further away generally we are from the actual truth of the issue. Most things are complicated. Most people are complicated. Most people are stuck between multiple different interpretations of a phenomena or of an event or of a political perspective. It's very rare that it's like, oh, this person is 100% correct, or this person is perfectly good. Solzhenitsyn got it right when he said that the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. People are complicated. People are not just this group or that group. They're not just Republican or Democrat. That's just wrong. And we've prioritized groupthink, and we've put ourselves into groups more than is useful and helpful. So that's kind of the gist of their book, at least from the three great untruths perspectives. And I'd love to get into it more, but I definitely would want to reread the book before I dive into more specifics. So we'll move on to the next one, just because, for the sake of time, and also just because I want to do it right when I do them each individually. So maybe this will be a good intro episode to the topics. We'll see. So the second one is directly related to the first, you could argue. The first, The Colony of the American Mind, is a pretty good overview of, I would say, more societal level problems that argue that, I would say Jonathan argues that to a large extent these untruths have emerged within academia, but then he talks about them from a broader, society level scale. The second book, The Parasitic Mind by Gad Saad, he's an evolutionary psychologist that specifically or takes a deeper look into what's going on in academia specifically. And this one I remember less than The Colony of the American Mind, so we'll see how well I can. I've done a little bit of digging into it again, but we'll see how well I can articulate it. So he published it in 2020. He explores this concept of parasitic ideas that infect and manipulate human minds, leading to irrational thinking, ideological extremism, and the erosion of common sense. So Dr. Saad, I suppose, his name is complicated, forgive me. It's just a weird one. He has firsthand experienced this within his own department, within his own sphere, within academia, and all I would say, or not all I would say, but one of the things I would say is, his book has some of the more crazy examples of what's going on, and his satire is so good. It's so good. You got to check it out. The examples that he brings up in the satire is just second to none. But back to the book. I mean, he focuses on the influence of postmodernism, specifically social justice ideology, political correctness, and identity politics in modern society. And then he argues that these ideas act as mind parasites that hijack rational thought processes and impede productive discourse. He talks about how they've infiltrated various domains, including academia, media, politics, and everyday life. And then he examines the impact of political correctness on free speech specifically. He also talks about the dangers of moral relativism and the distortions caused by identity politics. And then one other topic he talks about is the erosion of true science in the name of ideology, which, if anyone is familiar with the replication crisis, that also plays a role into this too, where we tend to look at science as, the end-all be-all in terms of the gold standard of what is true. And it turns out that not only is science a complicated process, but when you have humans who are fallible and are subject to emotions and biases, you end up with pretty poor science. And he talks about that to a large extent. This is something else you guys should look up. James Lindsay did a podcast with Joe Rogan a while back. and they talked about the grievance studies, which essentially are like all of the studies within academia that focus on hypothetical oppression. So, gender studies, feminism studies. I don't know if that's right. I don't know if it'd be female studies anymore, because that's that's politically incorrect. Females as such. But the point of the podcast they did, oh my gosh, it was so hilarious and terrifying. But they basically did everything in their power to create a bunch of like fake papers that would be bent towards a particular ideological perspective. So like a hyper progressive perspective. And what they did, like one of them is they used passages from Mein Kampf, which is Hitler's like diary essentially, and injected it into a ideologically let's say left-leaning progressive package, and then published it submit it for publication to these like different scientific journals within this realm. And I think they like submitted 15 studies, and then like 7 of them got accepted. And some of them, again, one of them was this Mein Kampf one. Another one was like dog humping in parks and how that's related to like what was it, human sexuality or something like that. All I gotta say is go listen to this podcast. It was so hilarious. It was one of the funniest things I've ever seen. It was also terrifying because these fake papers that like had purely ideological bents that had no scientific backing whatsoever got published, and some of them got like high rewards. So, and Dr. Sad has pointed this out, and he talks about that in the book. But his primary claim is that we have been infected as a society, from an academic perspective, with these parasitic mind viruses that are they essentially, they're kind of anti-truth. So they, like ideology, if you were to define the term ideology, one way to describe it would be a system of beliefs that posit one particular metric or one particular axiom by which all of their belief structures are justified and derived. So the danger of ideology is that it reduces everything to one cause, and then it's incredibly easy to it's easy to fall behind that, because all you have to do is think one thing, because it's one cause. So it's one particular way of thinking. And he talks about the dangers of this, and how that ideological possession and people that are obsessed with a particular ideological perspective they no longer are thinking rationally. They are possessed quite literally by the ideology. And we see this all the times with the extreme ends of political movements, but we saw it with the Nazis, we saw it with the Marxists in multiple different locations, Cuba, Cambodia, Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao's China, and we've seen the more, dark versions of what's happened with those particular ideological movements. And Dr. Saad is concerned that that's at least the direction that we could be going. So he's concerned about that with this idea of mind parasites. Let's see, what else do I have on him? Yeah, I mean, he talks about like what these mind parasites have done in terms of like polarization and intellectual diversity. And this is something else that Jonathan Haidt and both Dr. Saad have pointed out, which is that so let's say that you have a room of 50% Democrats and 50% Republicans. That's a pretty intellectually diverse room, right? And you're going to get different perspectives, and people are going to constantly be challenged on their own belief structures. However, as you start to skew that percentage towards a majority, as you get closer and closer towards a more extreme majority, so 70-30, you get this, let's say, polarization effect, I suppose, is one way to look at it. But what happens is people tend to move in one direction. So if you have 80% of your faculty is left-leaning and 20% isn't, what happens is there's this echo chamber effect where their ideas are just constantly getting reinforced. And within academia, it's really only the professors that are challenging each other's belief structures. Undergrads aren't really going to do that. So you have, 90% or 80% or 95% of your professors are all left-leaning Democrats and they're hyper-progressives, and they get in this groupthink echo chamber, and it just spirals to the point that they're just constantly getting more extreme in their belief structures and think that everyone should think the way that they think. So the irony of the diversity, equity, inclusion movement is that within academia itself, there's a complete lack of intellectual diversity. And yet, of course, that's not what the DEI people want. They want diversity in the sense of race, gender, whatever, group characteristic they happen to want. They want that. They don't actually care about intellectual diversity, which is the cornerstone of the university. So Dr. Sad is pointing this out, that this intellectual diversity is been absolutely scrapped. And Jonathan Haidt does an excellent analysis of the actual percentage of people, like percentage of Republicans in like these sociology departments, these gender studies departments, most of the social sciences. The skew is like, it's insane. Basically, what they found is like most public college institutions within sociology departments and these social sciences, the number of Republicans is below 10%. It's absolutely insane. What was it? He had a really good quote on this. Here we go. He said, the next time some academics tell you how important diversity is, ask them how many Republicans there are in their sociology department. And, he's directly makes that point, that what is true diversity? And this is a very interesting question. What's true diversity? Is it the color of your skin? Is that true diversity? Or is it who you are as a person and what you have to say, and your individual character and what you believe? Immutable characteristics like race is some of the most, in my opinion, some of the worst metrics for our diversity. Why do we care about it? I don't understand. I care about people's individual moral character and what they believe in. Why? Not the color of their skin, not something immutable. Why do I care about the level of melanin in their skin? That seems like such a stupid thing to care about. If you want to say that the level of melanin in their skin correlates to their own personal experience, that's fine, but then I would rather talk about their own personal experience, not the level of melanin. Why are we focusing on the level of melanin? It just seems idiotic to me. So he points this out. Same thing with gender, same thing with race or ethnicity, and whatever categorization you want to have it, or your sexual preference. That's now very important. Who you want to sleep with for whatever reason. And then one of the things he talks about is that one of the consequences of this group think is that friendships can easily get lost. And this is also in the Coddling the American Mind, where people just don't have friends that they disagree with civilly anymore. You just won't talk about politics because it's too potentially friendship killing of a conversation that you'll just avoid the conversation. And one of his quotes was, "Do not fear the loss of a friendship. Anyone who is willing to end a relationship because of a reasoned difference of opinion is not worthy of your friendship." And I think he's right about this. If you go try and just have a difficult conversation with random people, no, I take that back, not random people, that wouldn't make sense, but within your friend group, what percentage of your friends do you think are going to be willing and able to have that, and then able to shake hands afterwards? Because that's kind of critical. That's really important. And if we're not even able to talk about these issues anymore, what does that say about us? And I don't think that's a progressive thing. I think that's a regressive thing. To be incapable of talking about difficult issues because they offend you, that's regressive. That's not progressive. So he talks all about that. And then he goes back to the whole science thing, and another quote: "Science should be about the pursuit of truth, not about the defense of one's preferred political ideology or personal beliefs." And I couldn't agree more. And again, dude, his satire, the examples he brings up are so good. Like, some of these books sometimes can be kind of heavy. This is one that is not heavy because it's so funny. Even, let's say, you're a full-scale lefty. I mean, if you don't find this stuff funny, I mean, come on, man. This stuff is pretty funny. I at least hope I can still appreciate good humor no matter where it's coming from. And this is something the Babylon Bee, I think, does particularly well, because they make fun of whoever they want to make fun of. I mean, of course they're conservative. Like, yes, they are. But when they make fun of Republicans, I mean, I'm all for it, because there's some stuff to make fun of. That's for sure. So it's just a hilarious book. I definitely need to reread this one. It was pretty good. Okay, and that brings us to our last book, and arguably the most important one. In this one, I'll pledge that I will do a solo episode on, definitely. Or rather, a whole episode on. Forgive my collapse of brain cells. And it's Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier. And where the parasitic mind and the coddling the American mind are broader explorations of the idea pathogens and great untruths that are pervading society, Irreversible Damage is a in-your-face, close, terrifyingly well put together exploration into exactly a microcosm, I guess that's the right phrase, into what's going on specifically within the transgender realm. And she does an incredibly good job of just exploring what she's found. What's fascinating is, like, if you go look on Amazon, or if you go look, for books about transgenderism, you'll find that there basically are no books that take a critical perspective to it. They basically don't exist. And the few that do, mostly are like this one, which are just a analysis of it. They're not just a one-sided, bent perspective. Abigail Shrier interviews many people whom she agrees that are obviously living happier, healthier lives. But what she specifically focuses on is the rapid onset of gender dysphoria among teenage girls, specifically. And one of the things that she points out is that gender dysphoria is not something completely foreign in society. It's been around a while. But the demographic that it historically has affected has been young boys that thought they were girls. It's not been young girls that thought they were boys. This is new. And one of the things that all three of these books point to as part of the cause of these new social contagions, political issues, psychological issues, is the introduction of the iPhone in 2007. You can make a direct causal link between the introduction of the iPhone and a gigantic percentage of these different social contagions, new psychological problems. And it's an interesting question, man. Like, it brings us all of this awesome stuff, social media, a phone, but is it worth the cost? And it's an interesting question. It truly is. I did a podcast a while ago that looked at Amish happiness statistics, and, by all available metrics, the Amish are the happiest people in the United States. And I mean, there's lots to be said about them, but what does that say about the fact that they just don't mess with the whole social media thing? They don't mess with it. And it's a compelling argument based upon their statistics, and these books do an excellent job of saying, look, Look at this causal link. Look at how this has been affecting us psychologically, and it's not good. So she talks about how this demographic has shifted, and she makes the case that we are experiencing a social contagion, where instead of something being natural, it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. You have social factors at play, and young girls specifically are more apt to be affected by something like a social contagion. And we've seen this with cutting, for example, or anorexia, where you have this, what happens is this affirmative model within these groups of girls where there's they go to each other for emotional and mental support in a way that men don't. So here's an interesting thing. If you ask men who their best friends or friend is, they'll answer their wife on average. If you ask women, they'll answer another woman. And it goes to, some of the differences between men and women. Yes, I did just say that phrase. There are differences. And one of them is just how men and women interact with each other. And females, generally speaking, get into they're more affected arguably by their close friends and their peers from an emotional perspective in ways that men aren't. Again, this is just broad-based statistics. There's always exceptions to the rule. So that's something she points to as to why it's taking off in the way that it did, just like cutting, just like anorexia, that tend to affect girls. And then you couple that with social media, and you end up with this mess that is what's going on within the transgender realm right now. So she goes into the cultural, societal, technological factors that I just overviewed a little bit that contributed to this. And basically, it's like, I don't say this lightly, man. It's probably one of the most terrifying books that I've ever read in the cultural, political, social dimension. Like, no doubt. I've read way more terrifying books in the moral dimension, like The Gulag Archipelago and The Painted Bird and The Rape of Nanking. Like, books that deal with, like, the genuine depths of human evil that have happened in our past. But this one is, like, terrifying in a whole, like, different way, because it's children, and it's happening, like, at large right now. And not only are you not allowed to have a contrarian perspective, I mean, like, look, man, her book basically got banned by every major bookseller. At least they tried to ban it. And all she does is, like, offer a contrarian perspective. It's like, it goes to the point of these authors. It's like, we can't talk about things that certain groups don't agree with anymore. It's like, yeah, that's happening right now. That's for sure. So they're just proving their points, which is fascinating. But, she goes into this, and, stuff like a 4,000% increase in transgender youth in the UK. I mean, these are insane numbers, what's coming down here. And it's, the outcomes aren't great. And what's happening right now is at mass scale, young girls are being sterilized because they're going on puberty blockers or large amounts of testosterone. They're having permanent changes to their biology and psychology at ages before the age of 18 that are affecting them in the long term. And the reality is that we don't have long-term studies on people that have done this. We just don't. We don't have long-term studies on people that have gone through all these changes. We don't. And it's so that the doctors that are saying that it's perfectly safe, or that we know, or that, just listen to the experts, I mean, they're just lying to you. It's just not true. We don't know. One thing that we do know is that, at least in the past, the model was essentially a watchful waiting model, where you would let what used to normally be historically young boys grow out of their confusion. Most of the time, they actually ended up being gay. That's the interesting thing. There's a whole sub-movement within this that's essentially posits that the transgender movement is actually anti-gay, which has pretty compelling evidence behind it, because, again, most of the time, if you allow these dysphoric feelings to, instead of providing medical intervention, you just allow them to, like, continue. I mean, with psychological support, of course, what happens is the kids end up being gay. So there's a whole sub-movement within this that's like, you're just identifying gay people and then trying to change their gender, which, you know, by the way, you can't do because biology. So that's the other interesting thing. The whole thing's built on the lie. You can't actually change your gender. It's not possible. So we have this scenario where, and this is the really crazy thing, and here's a quote from her. "I can't think of any branch of medicine outside of cosmetic surgery where the patient makes the diagnosis and prescribes the treatment. This doesn't exist." So this is one of her big points, like how medicine works. What happens when you go and see a psychologist is you don't diagnose yourself. The psychologist does. The doctor does. The doctor's job and the psychologist's job is to get at what's going on. What's the truth of the problem? And they might not have the same perspective that you do. Imagine that you're anorexic and you walk into the doctor's office and you say, you know what, I'm really fat and I need fat burning pills. And imagine that by law, they're required to agree with you. That if they don't agree with you, if they don't take up this affirmative care model, they could lose their license and their job. That's what's happening right now within the transgender movement. Psychologists aren't allowed to disagree with the self-diagnosis of their own patients. This is insane. This is an inversion in medicine. This is not how medicine is supposed to be practiced. This is not how any of this is supposed to work. And it's ceding the ability for young girls to make life-altering decisions into their hands, and you aren't even legally allowed to tell them that they might be wrong. So this is insanity, and I can't stress how important I think this book is for anyone to read. I really do. And if you want to say, oh, okay, well, you know, it's a book that's against transgenderism or whatever you want to say, it's fine. It's fine. Go read one that isn't, but read both. You know, read both. Have a little bit of a contrarian perspective. I'm not saying she's right about everything, but I mean, I didn't see any problems with her analysis from a scientific perspective in terms of what she did. She just looked, I mean, she did like dozens and dozens of interviews with all sorts of different people that have all sorts of different perspectives on this issue. But it, terrifying book, but it's a must read. Truly is. So that'll do it for today. Run out of brain, and sorry if I felt a little bit rushed on this one. The truth is I kind of am. It's one of those days, but I'll spare you my problems. But hopefully you guys go check these out. Such good books on what's going on right now in the political progressive sphere, and I think they definitely need to be talked about. These are serious things going on, and we got to get our act together as a country. We really do. So, hope you enjoyed rather, and thank you for listening.